My name is Ferdinand Porsche. They say I am the man behind the Volkswagen Beetle and the founder of what would become the iconic Porsche brand, synonymous with German engineering, speed, and precision. I couldn't find the sports car of my dreams, so I built it myself, a quote many remember me by. Tonight, I will tell you the story of my life. Sorry, I'm not American. I'm an Austrian-born engineer from the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, now part of the Czech Republic. And today, please allow me to use English to tell the story. I know this isn't my mother tongue, but I want all of you, no matter where you're listening from, to understand my path, my triumphs, and my regrets. You might know the name Porsche from the racetracks, the luxury showrooms, or that familiar silhouette of the 911 gliding down a highway. But how many of you know how many battles were fought, not just on the road, but within myself, to build this legacy? How many times I started over or nearly lost everything? If you were me, experiencing what I experienced, torn between war and invention, passion and politics, would you do better than me? Or bring something even greater to humanity? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you could send a message to me in the past, perhaps to that young man in Maffersdorf tinkering with dynamos, what would you write? Leave a comment below. I'd like to hear your thoughts. Now listen to this interesting story about my life journey. I was born on September 3rd, 1875, in Maffersdorf, a small town nestled in what was then the Kingdom of Bohemia, part of the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire. Today, they call it Vratislavic nad Nisou in the Czech Republic. Back then, it was a quiet place of cobblestone streets, chiming church bells, and families that worked with their hands. My father, Anton Porsche, was one of them. A master tinsmith, a stern man, steady, practical. He owned a small workshop and wanted me to follow in his footsteps, quite literally hammering metal and shaping sheets with patience and precision. But even as a child, my eyes wandered elsewhere. I remember sitting on the floor of his shop, watching the glow of fire against the steel, and while he saw craftsmanship, I saw potential, movement, motion, machines. I was fascinated by how things worked, not just how they were made, but how they moved. Wheels, gears, the hum of tension being released. We weren't wealthy. Formal education was not expected for children like me. We were expected to work. But I had one thing going for me, an unquenchable curiosity. At night, I'd take apart the oil lamps and try to rebuild them. Once I rigged a small dynamo to light our home long before electricity was standard in the village. My father was furious, said I'd burned out half the candles for nothing. But then, the lamp lit, and he said nothing more. That was the first time he looked at me not as a misbehaving boy, but perhaps as something else. By the time I was a teenager, I was sneaking into the local textile factory just to catch glimpses of their machinery. I would stand for hours near the spinning turbines and belt-driven looms. The sounds to others were just noise, but to me they were a song, a symphony of moving parts playing in harmony. I knew I couldn't stay in Maffersdorf forever. At 16, I began working formally in my father's workshop, as expected. But on the side, I started taking night classes at the Staatsgewerbeschule in Reichenberg, the nearest technical school. I didn't have a high school diploma. I didn't even formally graduate. But the instructors noticed something in me. This boy from the tinsmith's family, who could take apart a motor and improve it without blueprints. I was never trained in engineering the traditional way, but I read every manual I could find, listened carefully, and experimented relentlessly. Once, during those early years, I built a small generator using scrap copper wire and a bicycle wheel. It hummed to life on a rainy afternoon and powered a crude set of lights in my parents' living room. My mother wept. My father just nodded, then left the room. That too meant more than words. You see, I never truly believed in waiting for permission to build. If I saw something broken or missing, I tried to fix it or invent it. Now let me ask you something. If you had been born in a sleepy town, to a modest family, with no access to elite schools or big city mentors, would you believe enough in your own curiosity to break through that wall? Or would you do as most did, stay, settle, survive? Leave a comment. I wonder what your younger self would choose. By 1893, when I was 18, I made a decision that changed everything. I left Maffersdorf. I went to Vienna. To my father, it was almost a betrayal. But to me, it was inevitable. Vienna was the heart of the empire, a bustling city filled with light, machines, and minds far greater than mine. I had no formal invitation, no job lined up, just a head full of ideas and a heart unwilling to beat at the pace of a small-town tinsmith. The truth is, I was terrified. But that fear, I would come to learn, was a companion of every man who dared to walk into the unknown. It whispers to you, but it doesn't control you unless you let it. So I packed my tools, a few clothes, and my resolve. I kissed my mother on the cheek and shook my father's hand. That was the last time I lived in Maffersdorf as a boy. What awaited me in Vienna would be the spark that lit the rest of my life. Vienna was everything Maffersdorf was not. Noise, bustle, streetcars clanging along their tracks, posters pasted onto every available wall shouting about operas, steam exhibitions, and political debates. It was the beating heart of the empire. And to a boy of 18 with barely a high school education, it could have been terrifying. But for me, it was fuel. My first job came quickly. I was hired as a mechanic at the Bela Egger & Komberman Electrical Company, which would later become Brown, Bovary, and CA. I was thrilled to be working with electricity, but I was still at the bottom rung. Greasy overalls, tightening bolts, repairing dynamos, running errands for senior engineers. Still, every moment was a lesson. I listened more than I spoke. I watched how the engineers moved, what books they read, what problems they struggled to solve. But I didn't stay on the sidelines for long. One evening, when one of the senior engineers was troubleshooting a stubborn piece of equipment, a complicated arc lamp that kept blowing fuses, I stepped forward quietly and asked if I could try something. He gave me a skeptical glance, but he was tired, so he said, "Go ahead." I adjusted the wiring, recalculated the amperage, and within minutes, the light hummed to life. No sparks, no smoke, just steady illumination. He stared at me. "How did you learn to do that?" he asked. I simply said, "I read your manuals, and I watched." That was the moment I began to move from worker to thinker. I became known for my uncanny ability to solve electrical issues without needing blueprints. I was promoted quickly, working my way up to a position where I was designing improvements to their systems. But even as I thrived, I couldn't shake the feeling that my true calling lay not in lamps or power stations, but in motion, in vehicles. In 1897, a miraculous thing happened. I joined the newly founded Lohner Werke Company. It was here that I stepped into the world of automobiles, still in their infancy. And everything changed. You might not recognize the name Lohner today, but back then they were pioneers. And I was still just 22. They had an idea. What if a vehicle could be powered not by steam or fuel alone, but by electricity? Remember, this was the 1890s. Cars were rare beasts, loud, unreliable, temperamental machines. And electric cars? That was the stuff of science fiction. But I believed. I designed what would become the Lohner Porsche, the world's first hybrid vehicle. Yes, hybrid. Long before Tesla, long before Toyota, there was me, cramming battery packs and electric motors into a carriage-like frame. Instead of an engine at the center, I placed electric motors inside the wheel hubs. A concept so ahead of its time, it would take the world another century to embrace it fully. The year was 1900, and I was standing in the middle of the Paris Exposition. The smell of engine oil and cigar smoke hung in the air, blending with the crisp chill of early spring. Around me were towering marvels of steel and electricity, giant light displays, intricate machinery, and more inventions than one mind could absorb in a day. But at the center of it all, drawing crowds and whispers, was a quiet, strange-looking vehicle with motors hidden inside its wheels. That was my creation, the Lohner Porsche. I remember the faces, the disbelief. Some leaned in closer to check if it was real. Others whispered that it must be a trick. It didn't sound like a car. No pistons hammering, no exhaust popping, just the faint hum of motion. Quiet, smooth, too smooth, some muttered. But it worked. 4 in-wheel hub motors, no gearbox, no clutch. Batteries that could hold a charge long enough for short journeys through the city. And it moved gracefully, like a whisper among the thunderous roars of internal combustion. This was one of the proudest moments of my youth. Not because I became famous overnight, but because I saw what invention could do. It could leap over expectations. It could make a poor boy from Maffersdorf stand toe-to-toe with professors and barons. It could make something real, something that moved people, literally and emotionally. We even went further. A second version paired an internal combustion engine with the electric drive system. This hybrid, the Semper Vivus, was so ahead of its time that even today, when people look back, they're surprised to find that such a thing existed over a century ago. But back then, it wasn't seen as revolutionary. It was seen as curious. Still, curiosity is often the beginning of change. Lohner received more than 300 orders. Our tiny team struggled to keep up. I worked nearly around the clock. I wasn't just designing. I was testing, recalibrating, refining. I drove the prototypes myself. Often I pushed them too hard. One night in 1901, while testing an improved motor system outside of Vienna, I lost control on a turn and wrecked the front axle. The car was ruined, but I wasn't injured. I remember sitting there, in the dark, mud on my boots, rain dripping off my cap, and smiling. Because failure, to me, was never the end. It was always a prompt. Do it better. Over the next few years, I began working on more advanced designs. Lighter frames, better steering systems, regenerative braking, and more efficient battery layouts. Some of these ideas were so advanced that they couldn't be manufactured affordably at the time. And that's something most people don't understand about invention. Having the idea is only half the battle. The world also has to be ready. Now I ask you, if you had invented something that the world wasn't ready for, would you keep going? Or would you shelve the dream, tell yourself it wasn't meant to be, and return to safer ground? Let me know. I'm curious what kind of soul you carry. There were setbacks, of course. The batteries we used were heavy and fragile. The charging infrastructure didn't exist. Gasoline cars began to improve rapidly. With each passing year, their engines grew more powerful and reliable. The tide was turning, and I could feel it. By 1903, Lohner was starting to focus more on conventional designs, and I found myself torn. I loved electric propulsion. Still do. But I couldn't ignore where the world was heading. The combustion engine was winning. So I made a decision, not with bitterness, but with clarity. I would master that technology too. And so I began studying the internal combustion engine, not just the mechanics of it, but the philosophy behind it. How power could be harnessed from fire and pressure. How a system of explosions could become something elegant, reliable, even poetic. Some nights, I would take a partially assembled engine home and lay it out on my apartment floor, like a puzzle. I'd study the pistons, the crankshafts, the valves. I wasn't content with just understanding it. I wanted to improve it. This is something I want my grandchildren and any young mind listening to understand. Curiosity isn't passive. It's not just wondering. It's chasing. It's touching. It's rebuilding what already works, just to see why it works. In 1904, I received a new challenge. Lohner had begun collaborating with Austro-Daimler, and I was given more authority to design cars with gasoline engines. I still had no formal engineering degree, but no one seemed to care anymore. My results spoke louder than any certificate. That year, I built one of my favorite early machines, a racing car equipped with a 4-cylinder engine that produced more power than anything I'd ever worked on. I took it to the Exelberg hill climb race near Vienna and drove it myself. And I won. That victory, my first real race win, did more than raise eyebrows. It confirmed something inside me. Not just that I could build great machines, but that I understood what they needed to feel like. Speed wasn't just numbers. It was a sensation, a language, and I was beginning to speak it fluently. By 1905, I was no longer just an employee. I was a name. A man people talked about in design circles and workshops. Some still criticized my lack of formal education, Others admired it. But no one could deny that I made machines that worked. Better yet, they won. One evening that year, I received a letter from my father. He had heard about my race win in the papers. It was short, just a few lines. But it ended with something he had never said before. I may not understand what you build, but I see now that you were meant to build it. I cried. So, young dreamer, if you're listening, and your family doesn't yet understand your path, remember this: sometimes the recognition comes later, much later, but keep going, show them, let your work speak, because eventually, it will. By 1906, I was still in my early 30s, but the winds of my career had shifted again, this time more forcefully, more permanently. That year, I was appointed the technical director of Austro-Daimler, one of the most important automobile manufacturers in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The company was based in Wiener Neustadt, just south of Vienna. It was a tremendous step up in responsibility and in risk. Let me tell you this: success doesn't make life easier. It just raises the stakes. Every decision echoes louder, and every failure carries more weight. As technical director, I now had teams to lead, deadlines to meet, and a company's fortunes resting, at least in part, on my shoulders. My first task was to improve their vehicle line, both in performance and prestige. Austro-Daimler had been known more for reliability than excitement. I wanted to change that. I believed a car could be both reliable and inspiring, a machine that stirred something inside its driver, and so I threw myself into the work. I designed new engine types, improved suspensions, developed faster models. One of my early breakthroughs was the Prince Heinrich model in 1910, a touring car with a powerful engine that could reach 85 kilometers per hour, which was astonishing in its time. And yes, I drove it myself in the Prince Henry Tour, a prestigious road race across Europe. And yes, I won. There's something deeply satisfying about that, you know. Designing a machine and proving it works with your own hands, your own nerves, your own instincts behind the wheel. The public began associating my name not just with technical brilliance, but with real-world performance. I liked that. It felt honest. By now, I was no longer working in isolation. I had a team of engineers, mechanics, apprentices. Some were loyal, others ambitious. There were long nights of arguments over designs, budget meetings that drained the soul, and corporate pressures that I had never faced before. Austro-Daimler expected results, prestige, sales, medals, and I delivered. But success, as I said, never comes without its storms. In 1914, war broke out across Europe. The Great War, the First World War, and suddenly, my world of engines and races was pulled into something much darker. Austro-Daimler was ordered to pivot to military production. I was tasked with developing military vehicles, aircraft engines, artillery tractors, and all manner of machinery for war. I had always built things to move people. Now I was building things that could help destroy. I will not lie to you. This was one of the heaviest periods of my life. The pressures were immense. The military had endless demands. Designs had to be rushed, tested under harsh conditions, then built in massive numbers. My factories were operating day and night. I barely slept. Some nights, I wandered the factory floor just to escape my own thoughts. The sounds of hammering, drilling, the endless rhythm of war. It haunted me. Do you understand what it means to build something that might save one soldier's life and take another's? It's not a question engineers are trained to answer. Still, I kept working. I told myself I was protecting my country, that we were all just doing what we had to do. But late at night, I questioned it all. I questioned what invention meant, what progress meant, when its fruits could be used for such destruction. If you had been me, thrust into a war not of your making, your talents turned toward weaponry, what would you have done? Would you walk away, or try to guide the storm from within? Leave me a comment. I'm curious what your answer would be. Despite my doubts, I kept pushing boundaries. I designed an armored car known as the M17, a heavy beast that rolled over trenches and rough terrain. I also worked on aircraft engines, helping Austro-Hungarian pilots compete against better-equipped enemies. And for this work, I was decorated, honored, promoted. In 1917, I was made general director of Austro-Daimler, the top post, the highest rung. I had come a long way from my father's tinsmith shop. But by then, the world had changed too much. The empire was crumbling. Soldiers were starving. Revolutions stirred in the cities. And when the war ended in 1918, Austria-Hungary dissolved. The map of Europe was redrawn. And Austro-Daimler, like many companies, was left battered, confused, and unsure of its place in this new reality. I stayed on for a while, tried to help rebuild, tried to return the company to civilian production, luxury touring cars, delivery vehicles, taxis. But the economy was broken. Inflation was brutal. Politics poisoned everything. Worse still, I was no longer the rising star. I was now the establishment. Some younger engineers began to challenge my methods. Executives questioned my decisions. I was still winning awards for design, yes, but the company was struggling financially, and I was blamed for things outside my control. Sometimes I wonder, did I stay too long? Sometimes, the hardest thing to do is let go. But there is a wisdom in stepping aside, even when your heart still beats for the work. In 1922, I submitted my resignation. I packed up my office, took one last walk through the factory, shook hands with the men I had mentored, the men who had fought alongside me through the chaos of war and invention. And I left. It was the end of an era. 17 years at Austro-Daimler. So many dreams, so many sacrifices. And now, silence. I didn't know what would come next. I had no clear plan, no job waiting. Just my mind, my hands, and an old hunger still flickering beneath the fatigue. The year was 1923. I was 48 years old. I had just resigned from Austro-Daimler after nearly 2 decades of building, leading, and surviving. Surviving war, politics, fatigue, and doubt. Most men my age might have considered retirement, or at least a quieter life. But I had never been good at being still. Stillness frightened me more than failure. At first, I drifted. I accepted a position at Daimler Motorengesellschaft in Stuttgart as a chief engineer. The offer was generous, and I was flattered. This was Daimler, after all, the company Carl Benz helped build, the home of the Mercedes name, a place of great minds and even greater ambitions. They wanted me to breathe new life into their cars, make them faster, sleeker, more competitive. And I did. My first creation there was the Mercedes Monza, a sleek, low-slung race car with an aircraft-derived engine. It roared like thunder and flew like lightning. That car was a machine of precision, born out of rage and elegance all at once. It brought wins to the brand, and it brought recognition back to my name. For a time, I felt invigorated, but there were tensions. Daimler was a large company with many voices, many egos, many ambitions that didn't always align with mine. I pushed for innovation, for performance, for daring design. But the board, the executives, they worried more about the bottom line. They wanted production efficiency, mass market appeal. We began to clash. They asked for compromise. I asked for greatness. And so, again, I left. This time it was more painful. Not because I lost a title or a company badge, but because I feared I was running out of places to go. Who would want to hire a man with a growing reputation for being too bold, too stubborn, too independent? By 1928, I was effectively unemployed. Not jobless. I still took consulting work where I could, but directionless. I was 53. I had a family to support, a wife, 2 children. One of them, Ferry, was showing promise in engineering, and I couldn't bear the thought that he might see his father as someone who peaked during the war and faded into quiet obscurity. That fear fueled me. Sometimes fear is just disguised love. So I made a decision. One that would change everything. I would go into business for myself. With the help of my family, I established the Dr. Ing HCF Porsche GmbH in 1931, right in the heart of Stuttgart. A small design office. Just a handful of engineers. No factory. No assembly line. Just ideas. And a name that still carried some weight. I remember the smell of the ink drying on the registration papers. Dr. Ing, HCF Porsche GmbH, Konstruktionen und Beratungen für Motoren und Fahrzeuge. That was the name. Long, formal. But behind those serious German words was something much simpler. Hope. Hope that a man in his 50s, with no factory and no deep-pocketed backer, could build something from nothing again. That a legacy didn't have to end with retirement. That maybe, just maybe, this office, this tiny design consultancy, could become something meaningful. For me, for my family, and maybe one day, for the world. I rented a modest building in Stuttgart. My son Ferry, just in his early 20s then, joined me full-time. He was sharp, not just technically capable, but steady, quiet where I was impatient, methodical where I was instinctive. We made a good team even then, though I doubt either of us truly saw what would come from those first months. The walls were bare. Our tools were few. We had no production line, only drawing boards, measuring instruments, and a hunger to make machines that mattered. And at first, all we could do was design. Our model was simple. Other companies would come to us when they needed something special, an engine that could outperform its rivals, a chassis that would handle better, a prototype that no one else could figure out. We were the secret weapon in the back pocket of struggling automakers. I didn't mind. Let others chase the spotlight. I was here to build. Our first few contracts were small, but important. One was for Wanderer, a respectable German firm. We designed a 6-cylinder engine for their new car. Not just powerful, elegant, efficient. We didn't just want to make things go fast. We wanted to make them feel right. Another request came from NSU and Zundap. Both wanted a Volksauto, a people's car. Small, lightweight, cheap to build. It was an interesting idea. Not quite the grand challenge I had hoped for, but I took it seriously. I sketched dozens of layouts, rear engines, air-cooled systems, simple suspension. I had a vision forming in my head, a car for everyone, not just the elite. And then, in 1933, the course of our history tilted. Adolf Hitler had come to power in Germany. Now, this is the part of my story that I must tell carefully, truthfully, with no dramatics and no defense. The new regime was fascinated with engineering. Hitler, in particular, saw cars as a symbol of progress, a tool to unite the German people. He wanted highways. He wanted motion. He wanted a vehicle that any working man could afford. And he wanted someone who could make it happen. My name was already known. And so, through layers of officials and meetings, I was summoned. They called it the KDF Wagen, Kraft durch Freude, or Strength Through Joy. But that name came later. In that moment, what mattered was this. I was offered the chance to design the Volkswagen, the people's car. The dream I'd been sketching quietly, refining on my own, now it had funding, backing, urgency. I accepted. It wasn't a political decision. It was an engineering one. Some might say I should have walked away. And maybe I should have. But when a man like me is offered the chance to design something for everyone, it's hard to say no. It felt at the time like a dream worth chasing. Let me ask you something. If the world's most powerful leader came to you, asked you to build your lifelong dream, and handed you the tools to do it, what would you have done? Please, answer honestly in the comments. I don't ask this lightly. So in our tiny design office, we got to work. I focused on simplicity, affordability, durability, rear engine layout, so the weight would be over the drive wheels, air-cooled, so no one had to worry about antifreeze in winter, and a body shape that was aerodynamic, what some would later call a Beetle. Yes, that Beetle. It wasn't perfect at first. The early prototypes overheated. The axles were stiff. The engine struggled on hills. But we learned. We tested. We iterated. Slowly, the car took shape. In 1934, the German government officially contracted us to continue the development. The pressure was intense. Every screw, every weld, every ounce of weight, it all had to serve a purpose. Ferry helped me manage the workload. He had a gift for seeing what was about to go wrong before it ever did. We had no assembly line yet, no factory, just drawings and dreams. But for the first time in my life, I was building something not for the wealthy, not for the military, not for racers, but for the people. That felt right. And yet, There was a shadow, always a shadow. I heard whispers. I read the headlines. I knew what the regime was becoming, but I kept my head down. I told myself I was building cars, not politics, just as many others did. We were builders, that was our excuse. Perhaps you don't believe that. Perhaps you shouldn't. I only ask that you listen. Because history judges in hindsight, but life happens in moments, small ones. And in this moment, in 1934, my only focus was this: to give the world something that could outlive its darkness. A car that could carry families, that could teach a child what motion felt like, that could bring the road to anyone, not just the privileged. That's what I told myself. And maybe, in some way, that was true. When the official contract came through in June of 1934, I remember running my fingers across the paper for a long moment. The ink still smelled fresh. My design office, barely 3 years old, was now responsible for delivering something that no one else had dared to attempt. A mass-produced, affordable car for every German citizen. A Volkswagen, the people's car. It was a dream, yes, but one weighted with expectations, deadlines, and scrutiny. The Third Reich had its eye on me now, and not in a casual way. They wanted results, and they wanted them fast. Hitler himself took a particular interest in the project. He envisioned a car that could carry 2 adults and 3 children at 100 kilometers per hour, consume minimal fuel, and cost less than 1,000 Reichsmarks. It sounded impossible. But then again, so had electric wheel hub motors. So had the Monza race cars. So had survival after Austro-Daimler. So I said simply, we will build it. And we did. We began testing prototypes immediately. I called the earliest ones Type 60, though the public would later call them KDF wagons, and eventually, the Beetle. They were small, round-backed, rear-engined, and surprisingly elegant in their simplicity. I designed the frame to be light but sturdy, the suspension to handle both city streets and muddy roads. The air-cooled engine meant no radiators, no freezing in winter. It wasn't about making the best car, it was about making a possible one. Possible for everyone. Now I want you to think for a moment. If you were asked to build something for everyone, something universal, something humble yet enduring, what would you create? Would it be a tool, a book, a car? Let me know. I want to hear what legacy you'd aim for. By 1935, our team had refined the design into something truly special. The engine was now a 985cc flat 4, compact, efficient, reliable. The body was wind tunnel tested, shaped like a teardrop to reduce drag. The seats could be removed for added storage. Even the dashboard was designed with clarity and simplicity in mind. We built our first working prototypes that same year. We called them the V1 and V2, painted in black, with thin tires and long, flowing curves. They looked almost like toys to some, but when we rolled them out for demonstrations, they surprised everyone. Quiet, steady, nimble. But we knew testing on paved roads wasn't enough. Hitler had instructed that a new Autobahn system would connect the country. But the truth was, much of Germany still had unpaved, rough terrain. So we took the prototypes into the forest paths, the snowy fields, the dusty villages. We broke them. We fixed them, and we broke them again. That's how you build something that lasts. You don't protect it from the world. You throw it into the fire. By 1936, we unveiled the Type 60 at a press event, and the reviews were cautious but intrigued. Reporters called it odd, futuristic, even adorable. But they couldn't deny its promise. And when Hitler himself visited our offices, climbed into the prototype, and took it for a drive, he reportedly said, "This is what I imagined." That moment was both a triumph and the beginning of something far more complex. You see, Hitler had plans for this car, not just technical ones, but ideological ones. He wanted it to symbolize German strength, unity, and modernity. He ordered a massive factory to be built in a new town, Stadt des KDF-Wagens, which would later become Wolfsburg. An entire city designed around a single car. I visited the site myself in 1938. It was a field then, just steel skeletons and concrete mixers. But I could already see it. A place where thousands of workers would come together to build something that had started as a sketch on my desk. Something real, something lasting. And yet, I won't lie to you. There were times I felt uneasy. The regime around me was becoming more aggressive, more controlling. Jews were being purged from factories. Trade unions were crushed. And I tried to stay in my lane. I told myself I was building a car, not a weapon. I was serving the people, not the politics. But the lines began to blur. I was invited to dinners with Nazi officials, asked to join government commissions. My name appeared in propaganda materials. Whether I liked it or not, my work, the car I'd dreamed of for decades, was being used as a symbol of something I did not fully agree with. Some days, I buried that discomfort in work. Other days, I stared at my hands and asked myself, is this what invention was meant for? You see, invention can't always choose its owner. Once something is built, it takes on a life of its own. It becomes part of history, part of culture, sometimes even part of darkness. But still, I pressed on. In July of 1938, the first real production models were unveiled. The press marveled at their simplicity. Orders began pouring in, paid for in small installments by average workers across Germany who believed this car would be theirs one day. They were promised the car through a savings scheme. But the war would change everything, and the people, in the end, would not receive their cars. That's a story for another night. But for now, remember this. I didn't know how far it would all go. None of us did. I thought I was building something for joy, for freedom, for families to explore the open roads, and maybe in some small way, I still was. If you were me, seeing your life's work rise under a flag you didn't wave, but unable to turn away from, what would you do? Would you stop building? Or would you tell yourself, as I did, maybe good can still come of this? In 1939, Europe was trembling on the edge, and we all felt it, whether we admitted it or not. The news spoke in careful tones, border tensions, mobilizations, negotiations, but we all knew war was coming. When the invasion of Poland began that September, the illusion shattered. And once again, as it had in 1914, my work was pulled into something far larger, far darker. The Volkswagen factory in Wolfsburg was nearly ready by then. Workers trained, machines installed. It was meant to build the people's car, a dream machine for families' joyrides and weekend trips. Instead, it was repurposed overnight to build military vehicles. No one asked me what I thought. They simply changed the orders. We were instructed to develop versions of the Volkswagen chassis for combat use. Light, maneuverable, able to traverse mud and snow. And so I designed the Kübelwagen, a stripped-down utility vehicle modeled on the civilian Beetle's frame. It was boxy, rugged, efficient. The German army loved it. Tens of thousands were produced. Next came the Schwimmwagen, an amphibious version of the same car. It could float, paddle through rivers, drive up muddy banks. I tested it myself, wearing a soaked coat and laughing like a schoolboy the first time it actually stayed afloat. Strange, isn't it? Even during war, there are still these small moments of invention, of joy. But those moments became rarer as the war deepened. We worked under constant pressure. The Ministry of Armaments wanted more vehicles, faster. There were supply shortages, factory bombings, and long nights where we had to draft replacement blueprints by candlelight because the power had been knocked out again. I was no longer an old engineer in a quiet design office. I was now, whether I liked it or not, a weapons contractor. I tried to tell myself that I was just doing what engineers do, solving problems, designing machines, keeping my workers employed. But beneath that logic was something else, something heavier. The regime was changing, growing more brutal, more arrogant. The factories used forced labor. Some of it came from prisoners, some from occupied territories. People brought in under threat, or worse. I didn't manage that labor directly. I didn't choose who was brought in. But it happened under my name, under my company. And I knew. You see, the truth doesn't always come in a flash. Sometimes it comes slowly, like fog thickening in a valley. At first, you tell yourself the rumors can't be true, then that they are outliers, then that it's too late to change anything. And finally, one night, you sit alone in your office, the blueprints scattered across your desk, and ask yourself, what have I become part of? I did not speak out. That is my burden. That is my shame. Some will say I was only doing my job, that I was just one man in a machine too vast to stop. But that excuse, even when it fits, does not bring peace. If you had been me then, with a lifetime of work, your family beside you, your company humming through the heart of war, your government watching closely, would you have risked everything to speak out? Would you leave a comment? I won't judge your answer. I only ask you to be honest. Technically, we achieved a great deal during those years. We developed new drive systems, improved suspension under fire, even began work on advanced tanks, like the Tiger Eye and the Elephant. Enormous machines with thick armor and devastating firepower. I led those projects too. But each design pulled me deeper. I remember a test drive of the Elephant prototype, codenamed Ferdinand, oddly enough. It was loud, slow, nearly indestructible, a marvel of engineering. And yet, standing beside it, I felt no pride. It wasn't built for movement. It was built for death. That was the war for me, a contradiction, a swirl of brilliance and sorrow. Every design a technical victory, every victory a human cost. There were times I thought about stepping away, but where would I go? What would become of my son Ferry, my workers, my reputation? We were deep inside the machinery now, gears locked in place. Sometimes I told myself, survive the storm first, reckon with it later. But storms leave wreckage, and in 1944 the Allies bombed Wolfsburg. The factory was in ruins. Our projects were delayed. And I began to feel my age. The long days, the mounting guilt, the shifting future. Even among my colleagues, once so proud and certain, there was doubt. Fear. We whispered about the future now, about what the world would say when it learned what had been done in these factories, in these camps, under this regime. And in my heart, I knew this. Whatever we had built, however brilliant, however efficient, none of it would matter unless we could answer for it. Germany was losing. The war was coming to an end, and the judgment was coming with it. Still, I kept working, because it was the only thing I knew how to do, but I began to prepare, quietly, for what might come after. I hoped there would be an after. That, somehow, redemption might still be possible. In 1945, Germany was in ruins. Cities collapsed into rubble. Factories, mine among them, bombed out, hollowed, silent. The Reich had fallen, and the world turned its eyes not only on those who ruled it, but on those who built it. I was 70 years old, and I knew deep in my bones that a reckoning was coming. When the Allied forces took control of Germany, they came not just for soldiers and generals, but for engineers, industrialists, designers, those who had enabled the war effort. I was among them. In December of 1945, I was arrested by French authorities and taken for questioning. The charge: crimes against humanity. Not for what I had directly done, but for what I had helped to make possible. The forced labor at the Volkswagen plant, the war machines I had designed, my collaboration with the Nazi regime. I was not placed on public trial like the others at Nuremberg, but I was detained, imprisoned, held without a formal conviction for nearly 2 years. I spent that time in a prison in Dijon. I want to tell you what it felt like, not as a headline, but as a man. The cell was small, cold, barely wide enough to stretch my arms. I had no drawing tools, no drafts, no engines to take apart. Just silence, just thoughts. At first I raged, not aloud. No, I was too proud for that. But inside I burned. Hadn't I given the world so much? Weren't my inventions beautiful, useful, necessary? Why then was I here? But after weeks, months, that rage gave way to something harder, something heavier. Reflection. I began to replay my life, piece by piece. The triumphs, the failures, the compromises. I thought of the people who had suffered so that my work could succeed. The laborers in Wolfsburg, the soldiers who rode in my vehicles toward death, the engineers I trained who went on to build even deadlier machines. And I thought of my son, Ferry. He was the one who kept the business alive while I was gone. He worked quietly, diligently, under the radar. In those difficult years, he designed and built our first post-war car, something that would change everything. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. But in that cell, it became clear to me. My time was ending. Not just because of my age, but because the world was changing. The old gods, speed, power, nationalism, were being replaced with new ones. Peace, simplicity, mobility for all. I would not lead in that world. But maybe my son could. Let me ask you something. If your life's work was now tarnished by history, would you try to clean it? Or would you pass it on, hoping the next hand could hold it better than you did? Tell me down in the comments. I wonder what you would choose. In 1947, I was released. Not cleared, just freed. The French dropped the case, but the stain remained. Still, I was alive. And in the twilight of my years, that was a gift. I returned to Austria, to Gmund, where Ferry had moved the remnants of our company. He welcomed me, not with pity, not with blame, but with purpose. He said, "Papa, we're building something." That something was small, elegant, and unlike anything I had ever made. It was the Porsche 356, our first true car under our family name. Ferry had designed it while I was imprisoned, using leftover parts, borrowed tools, and a vision of what driving could feel like in a new world. It was light, nimble, rear-engined like the Volkswagen, but it was sculpted, refined, designed for pleasure, not power. A car to enjoy, not to fear. When I first laid eyes on it, I smiled. A real smile, not the guarded kind I had worn for years. It wasn't my car. It was his. And that made it perfect. We began building them by hand. Just a few at first, then more. Slowly, the Porsche name, our name, began to mean something again. Not war, not politics, but motion, joy, craftsmanship. I was there to see the first few sold. I was there to see the glimmer of something I had almost lost. And I was there to let go. In 1950, I visited the new Volkswagen plant, now rebuilt under British supervision. The Beetle was finally in production, millions of them now. The people's car had truly become the people's. There was no swastika, no slogans, just cars. I stood quietly at the edge of the assembly line and watched. And I felt, in that moment, both shame and peace, because the machine had outlived the madness. That year, my health began to fail. My legs ached. My breathing shortened. My hands, once so steady, began to tremble. But I didn't fear death. I feared only unfinished work. In January 1951, I closed my eyes for the last time. I was 75 years old, not a hero, not a villain, just a man who tried to build something. To my children, to my grandchildren, to you, listening now, I say this: life will hand you tools. Some are sharp, some are dangerous, some, if you're lucky, are beautiful. Choose carefully what you build with them. And never forget, the things you create will one day speak for you. Let them say something worth remembering. After I was gone, the world kept spinning, as it always does. My body was buried, yes, but my work, my name, and most of all, my family carried on. Ferry Porsche took the wheel, literally and metaphorically, and what he did in the decades that followed, well, I often wonder if even I could have done it. He took the embers of a war-torn design office and turned them into a roaring flame, crafting a company not only respected, but loved across the world. The Porsche 356 that he had sketched while I was behind bars, it became the beginning of a lineage. Elegant, lightweight, spirited, a driver's car, built not to dominate, but to delight. It was hand-built at first, in our small Austrian shop in Gmund. But as demand grew, so did the dream. Ferry moved production back to Stuttgart, back to the heart of where it all began. And from there, history blossomed. In 1964, the world was introduced to the Porsche 911, a machine that would outlive every expectation, become a legend in its own right. Rear-engined like the Beetle, fast, refined, and unmistakable. That car, more than any other, became the icon of our name. I never touched its design, never turned a wrench on its assembly. But when I look at the 911 from wherever I now rest, I smile. Because I see myself in it, in its curves, in its contradictions, in its refusal to be ordinary. Ferry didn't do it alone. His son, Ferdinand Alexander Porsche, my grandson, joined the effort too. He designed the 911's first body and later went on to found Porsche Design, applying our family's aesthetic to watches, sunglasses, even pens. The language of motion distilled into elegance. And still, the name Porsche grew. Racing victories, engineering marvels. The 917, the 959, the Carrera GT, hybrids, electric concept cars. Even now, as you listen to this, someone is sliding into a Porsche Taycan, an electric machine that hums like a whisper but moves like a bullet. It's strange, isn't it? I was born before airplanes had fully conquered the sky. And now, the machines that carry my name fly silently, powered by invisible currents. What would I have thought of all this? Maybe I wouldn't have understood it, but I would have respected it. Because at its heart, none of it is about horsepower or lap times or luxury price tags. It's about precision, purpose, and passion. The same things I cherished as a boy sneaking into the workshop to wire the family home with electricity. If you trace the Porsche lineage today, you'll still find us there. My great-grandchildren, my name on the badges, my stubbornness in the engineering, my silence in the lines of every car. And yet, I want you to know something important. What lasts is not the machine. What lasts is the intention behind it. I didn't set out to become famous. I didn't dream of empires. I dreamt of solving problems, of making life move smoother, faster, better. I was flawed, yes. I made choices I now question. But the work was honest. And I think that's what my family has kept alive. Let me ask you one last question. If your great-grandchildren were to inherit your name, your tools, your blueprints, what would you want them to build? What would you hope they'd remember? Leave me a comment. I want to hear your legacy too. So many of us work in silence, unknown to history, but every life touches another. Every nut turned, every wheel aligned, every dream drawn on a napkin in the dark. It matters. My name may be on the cars, but my legacy lives in you too, in every dreamer, in every builder, in every person who takes something broken and dares to imagine it whole again. Thank you for listening. And if you've made it this far, maybe, just maybe, you understand me a little better now. So, we've come to the end. If you're still here with me, then I imagine you're lying in bed now, the lights low, your mind softening like warm wax after a long day. That gentle calm, that's where stories like mine settle best. You've heard the highs, the race wins, the engines, the birth of a company. You've heard the lows, the war, the prison, the doubt. But more than all that, I hope you heard a heartbeat, steady, imperfect, but real. Because life is not one long sprint. It's a series of turns, some sharp, some gentle, some that catch you off guard. And through all of them, the most important thing is to keep your hands on the wheel and your eyes forward, no matter what lies behind. My descendants, the generations who now carry the Porsche name, have done just that. They've built on the foundation I left, yes, but they've also steered in new directions. Electric cars, sustainable materials, innovation not just for speed, but for survival. I don't expect you to remember everything I've told you tonight. But perhaps, in a quiet moment someday, you'll pass by a sleek car with that familiar crest, a horse rearing on its hind legs, and think, that all began with a young boy in Bohemia who couldn't leave a wire untouched. My story is not unique because I was a genius. I wasn't. I was curious, restless, always a little impatient, and perhaps a little bit stubborn. I suspect some of you might be too, and if you are, don't apologize for it. Just make sure you build something with it, something lasting. Sleep well tonight, dear listener. Let the whir of engines fade. Let the questions wait for morning. You've heard enough for now. I'll be here in these words whenever you need to remember, not as an icon, just as Ferdinand, a builder, a dreamer, and a man who tried, truly tried, to leave something good behind. Sweet dreams.